Well, welcome and thanks so much for watching online or on TV today. We're so glad that you're joining us. You know, I was listening to the songs that we're going to be singing today, the lyrics throughout the week, and all I could think was just these songs were written for this time, this season that we're in. So I hope you'll join us in singing these from wherever you are. Thanks again for tuning in today. In the morning you sing over me, and I receive your mercy. Faithfulness is clear to see. It's constant every day. In the morning you sing over me, I receive your mercy. Your faithfulness is clear to see. It's like the sunrise, constant every day. Every breath I breathe, an invitation to believe you are creating something good. Though this season doesn't tell my story, I know you'll move mountains for me. You're just that good. So I'll give thanks to God when I don't have enough, 'cause He's more than enough, and He knows what I need. Will you continue worshiping with us as we sing about the greatness of our God? There is a promise that points beyond my failure. There is a still voice to silence all my fears. Even the worst of my mistakes are miracles in the making. Miracles in the making. By your stripes I am healed. With one touch I am made whole. You have spoken, and I know that it is so. In the storm you are peace, and your love won't let me go. You have spoken, and I know that it is so. In every season, your purpose
darkness, you have poured out grace. You brought me out of darkness, you have filled me with peace. Giver of mercy, you're my help in time of need. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are, and all your promises are yes and amen. And all your promises are yes and amen. Yes, they are. Beautiful Savior, you have brought me here. You pulled me from the ashes, you have broken every curse. Oh, blessed Redeemer, you have set this captive free. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are, and all your promises are yes and amen. And all your promises are yes and amen. Sing faithful, faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are, yes you are, Lord. And all your promises are yes and amen. And all your promises are yes and amen. Come on, y'all. You're my strong tower, where I find my rest. And I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. And I will rest in your promises. My confidence, it's in you, Lord, is your faithfulness. Oh, and I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. And I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. Say faithful, faithful you are, faithful.
Well, we've reached the time in our service where it's time to receive the Lord's tithes and offerings that come from a heart of gratitude and faith, and it gives me an opportunity to thank you for the incredible support that you've given us to continue on in this difficult time. As you know, our team is doing everything that we can to minister not only to the people of Wichita, but to people all around the world during this difficult time. And you've made that possible and are continuing to make that possible. So this is not just a time for us to receive the offering, but a time for me to thank you and to ask you to continue to keep it on your heart and mind, not only to support us financially, but through prayer as we continue to do all that God has called us to do during this time, believing that the best is yet to come.
Thanks for joining us this weekend. We have some exciting things coming up at New Spring that we want to let you know about. Our weekly services are now broadcast on TV and radio every Sunday. You can watch on Fox Kansas or My Wichita TV, or listen on KWLS 107.9 or Derby's Alive 105.9. Find our full broadcast schedule at newspring.org. If you're a music lover, don't miss our online First Wednesday service this Wednesday evening. Join us as we talk through some of our team's favorite worship moments of the last couple years, and make sure to stick around for a surprise at the end. Nothing can stop us from celebrating Mom. Honor the mother in your life by bringing her to our drive-through Mother's Day celebration this Friday evening. Anytime between 4 and 7, you can drive through our parking lot to pick up a few tokens of appreciation for your mom, plus see some familiar faces. Then make sure you tune in over the weekend for our May 9th and 10th Celebrate Mom service. Don't forget, during this season, we're posting encouraging daily videos for kids, students, and adults at noahswindow.org. For updates about our meeting and event schedule, visit newspring.org. Enjoy the service.
Over the last few weeks, we've watched the world shut down, and many of us are left wondering, will life ever return to normal? Whatever tomorrow brings, we can count on one thing. With God, the best is always yet to come. And this season of shutdown, we've been given an opportunity to prepare for a new beginning. So, let's take this time to get ready to restart.
Well, you know, from the 70s on, so for several decades now, we've had a phrase that's sort of been bouncing around in popular culture. It started off in economics and finances, a phrase about politics even sometimes, and then it sort of bounced back onto the world scene several years ago. But the phrase is this. The phrase is, never let a crisis go to waste. And what this phrase means is that there's opportunities in a crisis that you will never have at any other time. Now, that's certainly true economically, and it's probably true politically. But I want you to think today about the fact that in this crisis that we're in, there's opportunities that you're going to have in the middle of this that you're never going to have at any other time in your life. Our series is called Restart. And the reason we're calling our series Restart is because we're all sort of in this shared experience of a shutdown. It's very weird. We all are kind of going through the same thing together where life is sort of shut down. And you know whenever you're in the middle of a shutdown that at some point things are going to restart. But you start looking forward to that restart and you have to ask yourself, how do I want to do that? Maybe this is a good time to rethink how I live my life. Maybe this is a good time to rethink how I go about things. So that's what this series is about, is making sure that we restart in a wise way. When the end of this shutdown happens and we restart, we want to make sure that we do it in the best way possible. That's why we're talking about the fact that we should never let a crisis go to waste. This is principle number 3 in our series, because there are opportunities in the middle of this time that you'll never get again. I've been through some crises in my life, fortunately not very many. I do remember being a sophomore in Old Testament survey in Bible college in Florida in 2001 when my Bible instructor got up in front of the class and told us that America was under attack and that a plane had been flown into one of the World Trade Center towers. That was a crisis. I remember the uncertainty of the time and just the strangeness of not knowing what the next day was going to bring, especially living so far away from family. It just was a very, very strange time. Years ago, my wife and I were actually at a retreat center during the middle of the Estes Park mudslides, and we had a point in time where it was a very touch-and-go, dangerous sort of situation where we were just sort of praying that we would make it through to the next day. There was a time where we were staying in a Red Cross shelter. Never imagined that I would ever be doing anything like that, but that was a crisis. Now here we are, we're in the middle of another crisis, and very much like what I said about 2001, we're still wondering what tomorrow will bring, what will it be like, what's the rest of the situation going to end up being like? And I think the one thing that I've noticed about being in a crisis is that it forces clarity that we almost never have. It's like a lot of the distracting red tape of life that normally keeps us from focusing on the big stuff, the main things, starts to fade away in the middle of a crisis. And we begin to get very, very clear about the big stuff. And so I just want to ask you in our time together today to think about how we're going to approach the big stuff in our life by not letting this crisis go to waste. And by the way, this isn't just a good sort of self-help principle. This is a God thing. Did you know the Bible tells us that God never lets a crisis go to waste? In an earlier series this year, we said that God doesn't cause your crisis, but he can sure use your crisis. And we can go to this verse in the book of Romans that really talks about that. The Bible says that we know that in all things, including the middle of this crisis, including COVID, including all the stuff that we're going through, that even though God didn't cause it, in all things, God works. God is working behind the scenes of our crisis for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. That means that behind the scenes of your crisis, God is working. God isn't going to waste this crisis. And as a matter of fact, sometimes God will use a crisis to help us sort of restart in a better way. And that's what this talk is about. I just want to share with you in this short talk 3 ways that God uses a crisis in your life. Because the thing is, as I said, God doesn't cause the crisis, but he will use it in your life, and there are 3 specific ways that he does that. We're just going to review those really quickly. The first is this. Sometimes God will use a crisis to get your attention. I'm poster child for adult ADHD, and my attention tends to be kind of splayed. So it can be very difficult sometimes if somebody's trying to get my attention. And I have 2 daughters, and especially when they were littler, they might, be calling, hey dad. But if they were out of my eye line, I wouldn't hear them. I wouldn't sort of attend to it because I just wouldn't realize they were calling to me. And eventually, after they would keep calling my name, hey dad, eventually they would get right in front of my face and say, Dad, I'm trying to talk to you, to get my attention. Sometimes God is saying, hey, Jonathan, I'm trying to get your attention. And eventually God will get right in my face and say, hey, Jonathan, been trying to talk to you, been trying to get your attention. And sometimes it takes a crisis to do that. There's a very, very small book in the Old Testament called the book of Joel. And in the book of Joel, prophet of God is delivering a message to God's people. Now, to be honest with you, we're not exactly sure where to date the book of Joel. It's not completely clear. But we do know a few things about what God's people were going through just based off of what's written in the book. One thing we know is that the people of God had been through multiple battles with large people groups that had just kicked them around a lot. So they'd really struggled in these battles. But beyond that, we also know that the most recent thing that had happened to them is that they had been through this incredible attack of locusts. And locusts had come in and eaten everything green. All the crops were gone, and there was nothing edible. It was really a very, very difficult time. And I think the depressing thing about that, the really difficult thing about that is, who do you blame? Who do you blame for a locust crop coming in and taking out everything that's green? I mean, it's just something nobody can control. It just shows up, but it sort of ruins everything good that's going on in your life. So if we could relate to anything right now in Scripture, one thing is sure, we can relate to the people that God is talking to in the book of Joel, because who do you blame for COVID? There's nobody that you can blame for it. It's just something that has shown up, but it's upended a lot of our normal lives. So at least we have that in common. The prophet of God says this in the book of Joel chapter 2. This is why the Lord says, turn to me now while there is time. Listen, I'm trying to get your attention. Give me your hearts. Come with fasting, weeping, and mourning. Don't tear your clothing in your grief. And that was a cultural sign of sadness, was to rip your clothing. He said, instead, tear your hearts. Return to the Lord your God, for he is merciful and compassionate, slow to get angry and filled with unfailing love. He is eager to relent and not to punish. Who knows? Perhaps he will give you a reprieve, sending you a blessing instead of this curse. Perhaps you will be able to offer grain and wine to the Lord your God as before. Joel was saying, look, perhaps God can do a miracle here. It looks like everything is gone. It looks like the locusts have taken everything away, but perhaps God might do a miracle here so that you could even not just have crops again, but bring crops to God and worship. God is trying to get your attention, and I think that probably in those who are watching this online, on television, across the world, I wouldn't doubt that there are some people that God is trying to get their attention. Perhaps he's trying to get Jonathan's attention. Now there are 3 times when God will try to get your attention, at least 3, but I think these are 3 important ones. The first time is if you start living on autopilot. The people in the book of Joel, God's people, they had not only been sort of spiritually fickle, and that was kind of typical for the children of Israel, as they would be very devoted to God one minute, and then they would be, devoted to something else the next minute. They weren't just spiritually fickle; they had become routinely spiritually fickle, where it had just become sort of a habit, and they were locked into this pattern. It wasn't working for them, but they were kind of going through the motions. They were living on autopilot, and you probably know what this is like. You do something over and over again; it becomes a habit, a life pattern. Something that you may or may not like, but it becomes something you've done over and over again, and before long, you're kind of in a rut. You're kind of stuck doing the same thing over and over again. You're living on autopilot. I used to live on the south side of Wichita, in a suburb on the south side of Wichita. I'd have a pretty decent drive home every day from the church. And when I would be talking to my wife on the phone, I would always tell her I was getting close to our house if I passed the fire station on the corner, because that was just sort of like a mental marker for me. The fire station on the corner, I'm a few blocks from home, and that way I could call her and say, hey, I'm almost home. Is there anything that you need? And I'm like most people, I think. You drive that same route over and over and over and over again. You get to the point where it's almost on autopilot. I mean, you hate to say it, but it is almost on autopilot. You just drive it without thinking. If somebody were to ask you some specific question about what you saw on your drive, you might struggle to answer it because you're on autopilot. You've just done it a million times. You do it how you always do it. So one day I'm driving home, and I get stuck behind this terrible accident at that intersection. And I call my wife to let her know I'm going to be late because I'm stuck behind this wreck. I'm telling her I'm going to have to try to maybe do some sort of a U-turn, make a different path and get home. And she said, well, where's the accident? I said, it's right at the corner here by the fire station. I look up and there's no fire station. Literally, there's nothing there. The ground is leveled, and it turned out that our city had decided to build a different fire station. They leveled this one and they built something there in its place. And so I said, you will not believe this. They've leveled this fire station. It's completely gone. It's been bulldozed. And my wife said, yeah, it's been that way for like 3.5 weeks. Every day I'd been driving past that, had no idea. See, when you live on autopilot, you start to miss important markers. You start to miss important things that would inform you about your life, but you start to miss it because you're just so used to going through the motions and doing the same thing over and over again. And that was certainly the case for the people in the book of Joel. The other thing is, sometimes we live on autopilot so long that we sort of wear tracks in the road of our life and we become stuck in a rut. What I mean by being stuck in a rut is that you get to the point where if somebody were to say, are you living the way that you think you should live? Are you living wisely? Do you think the decisions you're making are smart? You would go, not really, at least in a particular area. Maybe they would ask you about your financial decisions, or maybe they would ask you about how you're parenting, or maybe they would ask you about your marriage, and you say, no, I know I'm not doing things the best way, but I'm doing things the way I always do them. And the reason we say that is because we've worn those tracks so well that we just sort of drift back in. And anytime we turn over a new leaf, I'm going to do better in my finances, I'm going to do better in my marriage, I'm going to do better at work. You can do it for a week, a couple weeks, maybe 6, but eventually you start to drift back into that rut because it's so well worn, into the road of your life that you just sort of drift back into it. Certainly, that's something that Joel was having to deal with. In the passage, he says, don't tear your clothing in your grief, but tear your hearts instead. He said, look, this deal of going back and forth, and 1 minute you're doing something that you know is wrong, and the next minute you're tearing your clothes in grief as some sort of spiritual grief ritual to show that you're returning to God, and then the next minute you're back into something that you shouldn't be, and the next minute you're going back and you're tearing your clothes. And nothing is happening in your heart. It's all just going through the motions, and you've gotten into this rut. And if somebody were to ask you, is your spiritual life where you think it should be, you'd have to go, no, it's not. But these tracks are so well worn that you sort of drift back into it. And Joel is saying, you're going to have to get real. You're going to have to start actually having something happen deep down in your heart. Not just a habit, not just a pattern, not just a rut, but you're going to have to get real and go deep. That's why he says you need to tear your hearts and not just your clothes. This may be an opportunity to do that you'll never get again. See, the thing about a crisis, in psychology, we say that a crisis is a pattern interrupter. See, patterns are powerful things in life. They do have a certain gravity. They pull us back into them. Habits and patterns, they pull us back in. But there is something about a crisis that interrupts the pattern. It's a time out from what we normally do. And it may be that during a crisis, you are more situated or better situated to break a habit or a pattern than you have ever been ever before. Perhaps that's why God is getting your attention, is to say, don't be stuck in this rut. Don't keep drifting, but make a deep down choice to make a change. Well, if you live on autopilot long enough, you'll end up stuck in a rut. If you're in a rut long enough, you'll be headed for a crash. My wife and I have been working with couples now for a long time. I've been working with couples for 10 years, doing couples counseling, coaching, whatever you want to call it. My wife works alongside me, and we've sort of developed our own nomenclature and wording for things over the years. We have something we call frantic mode. And we don't say that to make fun of anybody, but believe me, if you did my job, you would totally understand how common this is. That we'll be dealing with somebody who calls up, it'll, probably 70, 80% of the time, it's a guy who'll call up and say, I need to get in right away, and they're almost frantic in how they say that. And what we'll find out the more we spend time with them is here is a guy who had all these road signs saying, your marriage is in trouble, your marriage is in trouble. His wife is saying, we're in trouble, things aren't good, we need to go to counseling. And all through this, he says, I don't think there's a problem, I don't think there's a problem, there's no way I'm going to counseling. And eventually, her heart shuts down toward him, and that's when he hits frantic mode. That's when we get all the phone calls. That's when he says, I'll go see any counselor. He says there, I'll see any counselor that you name. I'll do anything that you want me to do. I'll help more around the house. All of a sudden, he's admitting to all these faults. I realize I haven't been there for you. I realize I haven't helped around the house. I realize I haven't been a good husband. I realize I haven't been a good dad. And you know what? I think a lot of that's genuine. Problem is, if you stay in a rut long enough, you're going to be headed for a crash. And when that crash happens, it's going to be a lot harder to pick up the pieces than if you make a choice earlier on. Avianca Flight 11 took off from France in 1983. It was a 747, had a very full load of passengers. And as the flight was coming into Spain, so it was an international flight, as this flight was coming into Spain, the pilot made a series of errors and ended up coming in too low for a landing. Basically, the pilot was pointing the plane towards some hills short of the airport. And so as a result of that, there's a warning system in commercial airplanes that comes on and lets you know that you're coming in too low. And it says, the warning system says, pull up, pull up, pull up. So the black box was recovered from this plane, and you can hear the warning system kick in, and you can hear it as a sort of little alarm kicks in, and it says, pull up, and you hear the pilot say in his own language, okay, and then there's an electronic notification that the pilot shuts off the warning system. And it's only moments after that that the plane hits 3 different hills and kills everybody but 11 people who were on the flight. Talking to somebody for whom this crisis is God saying, pull up, pull up, pull up. you're headed for a crash. You've been living on autopilot, you've gotten stuck in a rut, and now you're headed for a crash. And if you don't pull up, make a difference, make a choice, go deep in the heart, make a difference, decide that you're going to live a different life than you've lived so far, it's going to be very hard to pick up the pieces. Perhaps this crisis is going to protect you from a much greater crisis later on down the road. Joel says, that's why the Lord says, turn to me now while there is time, just as the warning system comes on and says, look, you got to do this now. Give me your hearts. So that's the first thing. Maybe God is using this crisis in your life to get your attention. There's another thing that God will use a crisis for in the life of a Christian, and that is to exercise your faith. Sometimes God uses a crisis to exercise our faith. Now, I could tell you that, I don't have very strong muscles. I don't have very big muscles, and I feel really bad about that, and I want to do something about that. Well, you would say to me, Jonathan, look, if you want to do something about that, you're going to have to exercise those muscles. If you exercise those muscles, it's actually just a very simple cause and effect thing in life. If you want to have bigger muscles, you got to exercise those muscles. But it's funny to me that Christians so often talk about faith as though it's something that nothing can be done about. Oh, I just struggle with faith. I don't feel like I have very strong faith. And certainly, Jesus references this in the Gospels. He'll talk about somebody who has little faith or has weak faith. But I'll hear a Christian talk about it as though there's nothing they can do about it. I just don't have very much faith. You know what? If you don't have very much faith, the answer is the same as it would be if you would say, I don't have very much muscle and I want more muscle. If you want more faith, you're going to have to exercise the faith that you do have. Hebrews 11 tells us what faith is. It says that faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. If you want to have greater faith, you're going to have to exercise confidence in what you hope for, and assurance of what you don't see. And in order to do that, you've got to believe that there is a God who is working in your situation, behind the crisis. In all things, God works. If you believe that, then the next step is to exercise confidence in that and to exercise assurance in that. Not assurance in all the details of how all this is going to turn out, because you don't know all the details and I don't know all the details. Not confidence in, I know for sure this is going to be the outcome for me or this is going to be the outcome for somebody I love, because we don't know that. We're not God. We don't know all of what's going to happen. But confidence that God knows and assurance that God is doing the right thing behind the scenes. Exercising our faith. James said this. He said, dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, when you deal with a crisis, consider it an opportunity for great joy. What is this? Some new kind of Christian masochism? No. He's saying, because if you have your faith tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. Your faith can grow if it's tested. Man, I wonder, I go to the workout facility, everybody looks so happy, I get it, the endorphins, and there's a whole biological thing there. Endorphins supposed to make us happy when we exercise, but that's not enough for me. Endorphins aren't going to do that. Why are people so happy when they work out? I think it's because they know that the testing of their bodies is going to build endurance or build strength, and there is a sense in which there is an understanding that what I am here doing is going to have a big payoff in the long run. I want to take you to a story where we see someone's faith being tested, and you see this person exercising extreme faith, and that's what may be called for in your life. I don't know what your circumstance is. This broadcast is going to places all over the country, all over the world. I don't know what your situation is in COVID, but I do know this. This may be a season where you're called to exercise extreme faith, and I want to take you to a point in the Bible where a person was called on to do that. This is about a prophet named Elijah, and Elijah is God's prophet. He has been tasked with delivering God's messages to a very evil king. And at this point, God has withheld rain to get this king's attention and to get his people's attention. And as a result, there's also been a famine. And so God has been miraculously feeding Elijah through this. And now God's got a new plan to feed Elijah. He says, go and live in the village of Zarephath near the city of Sidon. I have instructed a widow there to feed you. I'm not going to go into detail here because there's so little time, but God has been doing some kind of weird things to feed Elijah. If I'm Elijah, I'm excited now. Finally, this sounds normal. I'm going to go spend time with this widow. It's probably a rich widow, probably has a lot of food stored up, so this is going to be kind of a relaxing time. I've been in a crisis so far, but this is going to be a respite from the crisis. And so he goes to Zarephath. As he arrives at the gates of the village, he sees a widow gathering sticks. So this is the lady. And he asked her, "Would you please bring me a little water in a cup?" And as she was going to get it, he called to her, "Bring me a bite of bread too." And now this is when Elijah's going to find out just how bad things are for this widow. She said, "I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house, and I have only a handful of flour left in the jar and a little cooking oil in the bottom of the jug. Look how bad this crisis is. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook this last meal, and then my son and I will die." But Elijah said to her, now look at the opportunity to exercise extreme faith. Don't be afraid. Go ahead and do what you have said, but first make a little bread for me. What, Elijah? Did you not hear the setup? There's only enough to barely make enough for this woman and her son. Then they're going to die. They've got no source of income. They've got no more food coming their way. This is the last that they have. They barely have enough for the two of them, and you're asking her to go make some for you first. Why would he do that? Because God told him that he had commanded this widow to feed him. And also, we know that God had told this widow to feed Elijah. So Elijah is trusting that God is going to take care of this. He says, "You can use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There will always be flour and olive oil left in your containers until the time when the Lord sends rain and the crops grow again." So she did as Elijah said, not only because Elijah had said it was the right thing to do, but probably far more importantly because God had been telling her leading up to this, "I'm going to send this guy to you. It's your job to feed him." Even though she's thinking, how on earth can I do that? She trusts that God knows better than she knows. So she did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days. There was always enough flour and olive oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. But the story's not over. We move immediately to a second narrative, because sometime later the woman's son became sick, and Elijah's still living with his family. The son becomes sick, he grows worse and worse, and finally he died. Then she said to Elijah, "O man of God, what have you done to me? Have you come here to point out my sins and kill my son?" But Elijah replied, "Give me your son." Now that's extreme faith. Here's this woman, she's holding the body of her dead son in her arms, and she's saying, "Look what you've done. Look at what God has done, because you've brought this attention to me and my sins." And Elijah says, "Give me your son." And he took the child's body from her arms. That's faith. He carried him up the stairs to the room where he was staying and laid the body on his bed. And then Elijah cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, why have you brought tragedy to this widow who has opened her home to me, causing her son to die?" And he stretched himself out over the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, please let this child's life return to him." Then the Lord heard Elijah's prayer, and the life of the child returned, and he revived. Then Elijah brought him down from the upper room and gave him to his mother. "Look," he said, "your son is alive." Then the woman told Elijah, and this is what I want you to catch, "Now I know for sure that you're a man of God and that the Lord truly speaks through you." Sometimes God uses a crisis to exercise your faith. See, before the crisis, if you're a God follower, before the crisis, there are going to be some things you believe, and there are going to be some things that you think about God. There's going to be things that in theory you believe God can do something. In theory, you believe God might show up and handle a situation. In theory, you believe God is great enough to deal with a problem. But once you've been through the crisis, there is something about going through that fire that on the flip side of it, you know God can do it. You know God can rescue you. You know God is going to sustain you through it, lift you up through it, and take care of you all the way through it till you get on the other side. See, there's something about a crisis. That's why we said you don't waste a crisis. There is something about the situation you may never get again. It's the opportunity to recognize that God is doing something amazing so that when you get on the other side of it, it's not just that you think God will be there for you. You'll be one of the people on this planet that knows that God will be there for you. You'll be able to say, now I know for sure. I wouldn't have known for sure if I hadn't gone through this crisis. But now I know for sure. Sometimes God uses a crisis to get our attention. Sometimes God uses a crisis to help us exercise our faith. And then finally, sometimes God will use a crisis to point you toward your giant. Well, if you know your Bible, you kind of know where I'm going with this. In the Old Testament, there's a story that people refer to as the story of David and Goliath. David was a teenager at this point, but he was slated by God to be the next king of Israel. Very few people knew that. David and his family pretty much were the only ones. But this was a young man who was destined to do amazing things. That much he had in his heart. But nobody else really knew that he was an exceptional person. Nobody outside the sphere of his family. He goes to see his brothers who are fighting battles. This was common in the ancient world, that there were turf wars every year between different nations. And the nation of Israel was not really that big. There were a lot of other people groups that consistently fought against them. And I think it was difficult for those other people groups because they didn't recognize that God was on the side of his children, and so often they were able to fend off far bigger people groups that were fighting them. Unfortunately, in this case, the Philistines had a trick up their sleeve. They had an extra secret weapon, and that was a giant named Goliath. He was huge. And so they would send him out to taunt and make fun of God's people as they were lined up for battle. You've got the Philistines lined up for battle, God's children lined up for battle, and you've got Goliath coming out and making fun of everybody, making fun of God, and saying that God's people, the children of Israel, should send out somebody to fight him, and so they could have a one-on-one fight, and whoever would win, well, that would be the deciding factor. They wouldn't have to have a bloody battle where everybody was involved. They could just have a one-on-one match, and then whoever won, the other group became the slaves of the winning team. Now, honestly, the person who should have fought Goliath was Saul. Saul was the tallest guy in Israel. It's very clear from Scripture that Saul was the tallest guy in Israel. Goliath was the tallest guy among the Philistines. That's the setup. That's what should have happened. But we know from the Scripture that every time Goliath came out and dared them to a fight, that everybody in Israel, including Saul, would retreat and be trembling in fear until David shows up. David's dad sent him to go take some supplies to his brothers who were fighting in this battle. And when David saw that Goliath was making fun of God and making fun of God's people, he said, well, I'm not going to stand for this. And I believe that at that moment, he'd already decided he was going to go out and fight the giant, because he starts going around and asking people, what's the prize for killing this giant? What do you get for killing this giant? I don't think he would be asking that if he hadn't already decided that he was going to go after him. But his brother didn't particularly like that he was going around and asking this. I think it embarrassed his older brother. I mean, his older brother is more grown up, taller, and it's like my little kid brother is making a big thing about killing the giant. I wish he would just shut up. And so he kind of communicates that to David, and this is what David says in response. He says, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" He's saying, look, isn't there a crisis? Am I missing something? Seems to me like we've got a real crisis on our hands surely I'm not just making that up. Seems like we've got a real problem on our hands. Isn't there a cause? I'm talking to people who are watching this video feed right now that you know welling up within your heart that there is a cause that God has put on your heart during this crisis. And you know that you probably would never have felt it as deeply or be as sincerely moved by it if we weren't in the middle of this crisis. You identify with David because you would tell people around you, I don't get this. Do you not understand there's a cause? There's something here that is really important for us to deal with. Well, David ends up talking to King Saul because Saul hears there's this teenager making a lot of noise about fighting the giant. So Saul calls him in, and David says, look, don't worry, I'll take on this giant. And Saul's thinking, oh man, this is just terrible. Already I've got this problem with this giant, and now this is just going to be a joke. This little kid's going to go out and try to fight the giant and get killed, and I can't have that. And so Saul tries to get him to not do it. He's, you really don't need to do this. But David persists, and this is what he says. I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats. When a lion or bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I've done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. So Saul finally consented. All right, go ahead, and may the Lord be with you. This is really important. What is David saying? David's saying, this isn't my first crisis. I've been through crises before. And you know what's interesting? God's always helped me out. God's always been there. God's always brought me through it. See, this is what we're talking about when we said that when we exercise our faith in the middle of a crisis, what we end up with is a knowing for sure that God will be there for us. We know for sure that God is going to take care of us. That's how David was able to say, look, I'll go after this giant, because he said, this isn't my first rodeo. I've been through a lot of crises before. It's been something I've had to deal with multiple times, crises that might make somebody else really nervous. They don't make me nervous anymore because I've seen the worst of it. I've been in the middle of it. I've seen wild animals coming straight for me with their teeth, and God helped me beat them. So now I think I can do fine in this crisis. My hunch is wherever the COVID crisis finds you, my hunch is it's not the first crisis you've been through. You've probably been through several crises before. Isn't it true that God has been there for you? Isn't it true that God has helped you through the crisis, that you felt his arms sustaining you through the crisis, that you knew that no matter what, God was going to be there for you? So now, in the middle of this difficult time, it's time to stand up and say, you know what? God has been there for me before. I've made it through before. I'm not scared of this. I'm not scared of this. You know what? If God has helped me through before, I'm going to make it today. I'm going to be all right today. So I want to finish out just by saying this. In this crisis, and it is a crisis, and we all get that. This is a difficult season. I'm talking to people in my current coaching ministry where I'm coaching people online via web conferences, talking to couples who are having difficulties. The things that I'm hearing, it's just heart-rending what people are going through. Doubts about their job, doubts about their health, wondering, when is this going to end? When is it going to turn around? It is a crisis, but in this crisis, there's going to be a cause that no one feels as deeply as you do. It's going to be something that God uses to grip your heart, and you're going to sense an opportunity. See, that's the thing. A crisis is a difficult thing to go through, but it is also a launching pad. There's an opportunity in the crisis. Crises force creativity. We've certainly learned that in ministry. You see New Spring and the fact that we do the Noah's Window videos, and we're trying to figure out how to do ministry during this time. A crisis forces creativity, and there's something good about that. That when you're in the middle of a crisis, you're going to sense new opportunities, and that opportunity is going to be connected to a cause. There will be a cause that no one feels as deeply as you do. And then there will be a giant that no one can fight the way you can. I don't know. Maybe David fought the giant because if Saul had gone out there with all his armor and all of his battle training, still wouldn't have been able to fight the giant. There was something unique about David's situation. As you remember from that story, maybe as a kid in Sunday school, or maybe from learning the story as an adult, you remember that David went out there with nothing but a slingshot and a few rocks. He was so fortunate because God guided that rock as it came out of his slingshot, and it hit the giant right between the eyes and knocked him unconscious long enough for David to come and sever his head. That was a creative way of doing it. I gotta grant you. I can't imagine who among all of the Israelites that were lined up there for battle, I can't imagine who among them would have come up strategically with a slingshot plan. That's what we need to do. Let's take him out with a slingshot. The truth is, probably nobody could fight that giant the way David could. I don't know, what's the giant that you're facing today? What's the thing that nobody else is willing to take on but you? And you're willing to take it on not because there's something within you that says, yeah, I'm big enough, yeah, I'm mean enough, I can do it. You're willing to take it on because God has brought you through crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis, and you know that if God has met you in the middle of those crises, he'll meet you in the middle of this crisis. If that's you, my hunch is you are uniquely gifted to take on that giant. God has somehow wired you specially to take on that giant. There is a cause that no one will feel the way that you feel, and there is a giant that no one can fight the way that you can. So I just want to circle back to my original thought of never letting a crisis go to waste. That this is a time when you have a choice to make. Am I going to get absorbed by the difficulty of this crisis, or am I going to be fixated on the opportunity of this crisis? Am I going to be ready to restart based off of what God is going to teach me in this time? Before we close, as we often do, I want to give you an opportunity to start a new relationship with God if that's something that you've never done before. I don't know what your background is and how you found this broadcast today, but it could be that you would say, you know what, Jonathan, I need what you're talking about in my life. I need that God that you're talking about in my life. I need to be connected to him. It's a very easy thing to do. God has done all the heavy lifting. He has made all the arrangements for you to be a part of his family, including sending his son to die for you. All that remains is for you to answer him with a big yes. So you can follow along with this simple prayer with me if you would like. Reach out to God and solidify that relationship today. Ready? Here we go. Dear Jesus, thank you that you love me. Thank you that you died for me. I know I do wrong things, and I know I can't get to heaven on my own. Today, I accept your free gift of heaven and forgiveness. I believe in you, Jesus. In your name, amen. If you just made that decision and prayed that prayer with me, please text PRAYED to 97000, 97,000. If you text that to us, we want to get a gift to you. If you live within the continental U.S., we want to send a gift to you that will help you in your new journey with Christ. If you live outside the continental U.S., we want to try to give you digital materials that will help you as well. Thank you so much for joining us today.